a snow-dusted village nestled beneath the sky's quiet hush, there lived a shoemaker named Theo, gentle, humble, and known for shoes that seemed to carry warmth in every step. But when hard times arrived, and his shelves held only scraps, Theo's hope began to wear thin, until one winter's night, something wondrous happened. Shoes appeared on his workbench, finished, polished, perfect without a single stitch sewn by his own hand. Who had made them? How? And why? What began as a mystery soon became a magical journey filled with surprise, gratitude, and the quiet joy of kindness given freely. In 10 heartwarming chapters, the Elves and the Shoemaker invites readers into a world where midnight visitors work in secret, tiny boots carry big meaning, and a thank you stitched with love can change everything. As the story unfolds, you'll meet the cheerful elves behind the mystery. Follow Theo as he returns their kindness in the sweetest way, and discover how magic isn't always made of spells or sparkles, but of giving, gratitude, and the gentle power of doing good when no one is looking. So step inside. The fire's warm, the shoes are waiting, and the story, like all the best ones, is stitched together with heart. Once upon a time, in a quiet little village nestled between snowy hills, there lived a kind and humble shoemaker named Theo. Theo was known far and wide for his shoes soft, shiny, and stitched with care. His little shop sat on the corner of a cobblestone street, always warm inside with the scent of polished leather and the purr of his cheerful cat, Button. Every day, Theo sat by his wooden bench, brushing each shoe to perfection, humming softly as the snow fell outside. But times had become hard. With winter settling in and customers growing scarce, Theo found himself with only one piece of leather left. Each night, as the village quieted under a blanket of snow, Theo would sit at his bench and wonder if he could make it through the season. The candlelight flickered over his work, casting long shadows on the walls, and Button would curl up beside him, offering the only comfort he had left. Still, Theo never stopped crafting with love, even if his heart was heavy with worry. That night, with a tired sigh, he carefully laid his final piece of leather on the bench and blew out the candle. Tomorrow, he would make one last pair of shoes. And so, the shop fell into silence. Little did Theo know, magic was just around the corner. Morning came slowly, stretching golden rays across the rooftops of the snowy village. The frost on the shop windows caught the sunlight like tiny diamonds, and Button was the first to stir, stretching her paws and hopping down from the counter with a lazy meow. Theo yawned and shuffled out of bed, the chill of the floorboards tickling his feet. He wrapped his woolen shawl around his shoulders and stepped into the workshop, expecting to find the leather waiting just as he had left it. But what he saw made him stop in his tracks. There, on the workbench where the bare piece of leather had been, sat a finished pair of shoes. Not just any shoes, but the most beautiful pair he had ever seen. The leather had been cut with precision, stitched tighter than his old hands could manage, and polished until it shone like honey in the morning sun. Theo blinked, then laughed a soft, bewildered laugh that echoed in the quiet room. "Button," he said aloud, as if to confirm he wasn't dreaming. "Did you do this?" The cat merely blinked and padded over to sniff the masterpiece, curling around Theo's legs as if to say, "See? Told you good things happen." Theo picked up the shoes gently, turning them over in his hands. The soles were flawless, the stitches perfect, and they smelled of lavender and cedar, as if even the finishing touch had been done with care. It was impossible, and yet, there they were. He placed them carefully in the window display, brushing off the frost with his sleeve. And before the clock struck 10, something else extraordinary happened. A passerby stopped at the window, then another, and another. Word spread quickly through the village like warmth from a crackling fire. The old shoemaker had made a new pair of shoes, and they were better than ever before. Before long, the little shop was full of cheerful chatter and rosy cheeks. Theo smiled and welcomed them all, surprised by the sudden return of familiar faces and the sparkle of new ones. By nightfall, he had more orders than he'd had in months. That evening, as snow began to fall again and Button curled up by the hearth, Theo took another piece of leather from his drawer, this time from a small stash he'd hidden away, and set it gently on the bench. He looked at the table once more, smiled, and whispered, "Let's see what tomorrow brings." Then he blew out the candle, not with worry, but with hope. For the next few days, something truly magical began to unfold inside the little shop on the corner of the snowy lane. Each evening, Theo would lay out another piece of leather, sometimes just enough for one shoe, and each morning he would wake to find it transformed into a perfect, gleaming pair. Every shoe had its own charm. Some were polished like amber, some had decorative stitching shaped like snowflakes, and others shimmered faintly in the light as if dusted with stardust. Theo's heart swelled with gratitude and joy. He worked all day selling the miraculous shoes to eager villagers, then carefully prepared the bench at night, leaving out materials and tools as if setting the stage for invisible artists. But as wonder bloomed, so did curiosity. Who was doing this? And how? Theo asked around town. No one had seen anyone come or go. He tried to stay up and watch one evening, but exhaustion pulled his eyes shut before midnight. Button, for her part, remained mysteriously silent about the whole affair, though her tail seemed to twitch more excitedly each morning when the new shoes appeared. By the end of the week, Theo couldn't stand the mystery any longer. "I must find out," he whispered, gently stroking Button's fur. "Whoever is helping me deserves thanks, and maybe a warm meal too." That night, Theo prepared the bench as usual. He laid out 2 soft pieces of leather, neatly placed the tools beside them, and swept every speck of dust from the workspace. He even lit a small candle in the corner so there would be just enough glow to see by. Then, without blowing out the light, he stepped behind a long curtain near the back of the room. Button followed and settled beside him, tail curled around her paws. Theo gently held the curtain shut and crouched low, peeking through a tiny gap in the fabric. The shop fell into silence. Outside, the wind whispered through the snowy village. Time passed. The candle flickered. Theo's knees began to ache from crouching. And then, the clock struck midnight. With a soft hum like a bell heard underwater, a sparkle of golden dust twirled through the air. Theo held his breath. Out of the shimmer, 2 tiny figures appeared no taller than his knee, dressed in coats, stitched from patches of colorful cloth, and wearing boots no bigger than thimbles. One had wild silver hair and glowing orange eyes. The other's cheeks were dusted with glittering freckles, and her bobbed hair shone with blue and gold streaks. They landed gently on the bench, as light as snowflakes. Theo's eyes widened. His mouth fell open. "Elves!" The 2 little creatures began to work at once, their movements swift and joyful. One darted across the bench, pulling thread and tools into place, while the other began to sing a merry tune, no words, just a melody as bright as the moonlight. They stitched, they polished, they danced as they worked. Their hands moved like a blur. Hammers tapped softly. Thread twirled into perfect knots. All the while, their laughter sparkled through the shop like wind chimes in a breeze. Behind the curtain, Theo's heart beat fast with wonder. He had never seen anything so magical and so kind. He looked down at Button, who stared at the elves with the calm wisdom only cats possess. And in that quiet moment, hidden behind the curtain, Theo made a promise. He would find a way to say thank you properly. The elves had brought magic into his life. Now it was time to return that magic, the only way he knew how, with love. The next morning, as the village awoke beneath a shimmering blanket of snow, Theo's little shop brimmed with warmth. He had barely slept, but his heart was full, not with wonder this time, but with purpose. He moved slowly through the room, still thinking of the elves, their tiny fingers stitching, their laughter dancing through the air, their joyful, glowing eyes. Button followed close behind, occasionally batting at a loose thread as Theo walked. "They've done so much for us," Theo said aloud, running a hand along the smooth leather of the new shoes. "It's time we make something for them." Button meowed as if in agreement and leapt onto the bench beside him. And so, that day, Theo didn't take any new orders. He didn't polish, hammer, or sell a single shoe. Instead, he began a very special project. From the bottom drawer of his old cabinet, Theo pulled out colorful scraps of wool, bits of soft flannel, miniature buttons, and threads in every color he owned. He sorted each piece carefully, holding them up to the window light, measuring not with rulers but with care. He imagined what the elves might like: something warm for their tiny feet, something soft for their tiny hands. First, he cut pieces for 2 little coats. He stitched them in the brightest colors he had: one stitched in oranges, reds, and plum purples for the freckled elf, the other a teal and gold patchwork, with tiny wooden buttons for the spiky-haired one. He lined them both with scraps of velvet to keep them snug. Next came boots so small he could balance them on his palm. He crafted each pair carefully, lining the soles with bits of felt, and stitched the seams with gold thread, just to give them a little sparkle. And last of all, Theo knitted 2 hats, each with floppy tips and soft pom-poms at the end. Button helped by chasing the yarn across the floor, tangling herself in it more than once, but always looking proud of her contribution. By evening, the gifts were ready. Theo laid them out on the bench where the elves usually worked, the coats folded neatly, the boots side by side, the hats perched atop like crowns. He didn't leave out any leather this time, just the gifts, simple and perfect. Then he placed a tiny note beside them that read, "For the ones who stitch with joy, thank you." That night, the workshop glowed with a gentle stillness. No candle burned, no thread waited, just 2 small bundles of love left in the moonlight. Theo stepped back behind the curtain with Button once more. But this time, his heart was not full of curiosity, it was full of joy. Midnight struck. There was a hush in the air, not cold, but magical. With a shimmer of golden light and the soft sound of snow falling, the 2 elves appeared. They landed gently on the table and stopped. At first, they looked puzzled. Where was the leather? Where were the tools? Then they saw the gifts. The freckled elf gasped and placed her hands over her mouth. Her eyes sparkled brighter than ever. The silver-haired elf clapped his hands, jumping up and down with excitement. They picked up the coats with reverent fingers. One by one, they tried everything on spinning in their boots, twirling in their warm new coats, and finally tugging the floppy hats over their heads with glee. Then, holding hands, they danced. Not a working dance, not a hurrying dance, but a joyful, silly, spinning dance, full of gratitude and laughter. Their boots tapped on the wood, their pom-poms bounced as they twirled. Behind the curtain, Theo wiped a tear from his cheek. Button purred softly beside him. The elves didn't speak a word, but the look on their faces said everything. And just like that, they were gone. With one last spin, one last giggle, and a shower of golden sparkles, they disappeared into the night, leaving behind not silence, but the kind of stillness that hums with magic. Theo rose with the sun the next morning, though he hadn't slept a wink. His heart was too full for rest, still echoing with the laughter of dancing elves. He moved through the quiet shop, tidying up scraps and thread, straightening his little bench, and smiling at the 2 empty spots where tiny boots had danced just hours before. But when he opened the door to sweep away the night's snow, a hush fell over him. There, on the fresh white blanket outside, were footprints. Not his own, not human at all. 2 sets of the smallest prints he had ever seen led away from the shop door, zigzagging playfully through the snow before disappearing into the trees at the edge of the village. Theo stepped outside and followed them with his eyes. The snow crunched softly beneath his boots. The world was still, the sky pale with early light, and not a soul stirred on the street. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called softly, "Thank you." The wind rustled the trees in response, gentle and quiet, like the whisper of a smile. Back inside, Button leapt up to the workbench and nudged something with her nose. Theo turned and froze. There, resting exactly where the elves had danced, was a tiny charm. It was shaped like a shoe, carved from wood so fine it glowed in the morning light. The grain shimmered as if painted with moonlight, and it sparkled with the same faint golden dust that had followed the elves through the air. Tied to it was a slender ribbon, and on the ribbon, a message carved in the tiniest letters Theo had ever seen. For kindness returned, and joy freely given. Theo picked up the charm and turned it over in his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. Though it was small enough to fit on a single finger, it felt like the weight of the whole season, gratitude, magic, and wonder wrapped into one perfect gift. He held it close to his chest, eyes shining. The elves were gone. He knew that now. They had come with the snow and the silence and had danced back into the forest before the world awoke. But they had left behind something more than perfect shoes. They had left behind their magic, their joy, their gratitude. And Theo, in turn, had given them the warmth of a thank you stitched with love. He placed the charm gently on the mantle, beside a dried sprig of holly and a hand-drawn picture from a village child. It fit right in a quiet, beautiful reminder of that special night. Outside, the village began to stir. Children played in the snow. Neighbors waved good morning. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery across the lane. And inside Theo's shop, everything glowed just a little bit brighter. From that day forward, something in Theo's little shop changed, not just in how it looked, but in how it felt. The snow still fell. The days were still cold. But the shop itself seemed to glow, not with lamps or candles, but with something deeper. A kind of warmth that couldn't be swept away by wind or winter. Theo continued to make shoes, but now with a new kind of energy in his step. He woke each morning with joy, humming as he opened the shutters and lit the fireplace. The old weariness that once tugged at his shoulders had vanished. In its place was a spark, the quiet, steady kind that burns from a grateful heart. Customers returned in droves, not just because the shoes were beautiful, though they still were, but because something about the shop made people happy. Children tugged their parents toward the glowing windows. Villagers lingered a little longer inside, smiling more than usual, chatting with strangers as if they were old friends. Even those who didn't buy anything seemed to leave with lighter hearts. And Theo welcomed them all. He never mentioned the elves. Not once. He didn't need to. Some stories, he felt, were best kept close, not secret, but sacred. Still, he kept their memory alive in quiet ways. On the top shelf near the window, he displayed 2 tiny shoes, just samples, he told curious customers, though their size made most people smile and shake their heads. Above them, he hung the wooden charm on a thin gold thread, where it twinkled softly in the morning light. Button remained queen of the counter, of course, stretched out across fabric piles, pawing at laces and accepting head scratches from young and old alike. And whenever a child asked Theo how he made his shoes so perfect, he would grin and tap his chest. With love, he'd say, stitched in every step. But deep down, Theo knew it was something more, something magic. Not magic like spells or wands, but the quieter kind. The kind made of kindness returned, of joy given freely, of thankfulness sewn into the seams of everyday life. The shop didn't need elves to be magical anymore. The magic was already there in every stitch, in every smile, in every soft pair of shoes that walked out the door. And though the elves were gone, Theo often found himself glancing toward the woods as he swept the porch each night, just in case. Because even if they never came back, their story lived on, not just in leather and thread, but in the warmth that now lived forever in Theo's little shop that glowed. One crisp morning, as icicles hung like glass feathers from rooftops and the sun lit the snow in shades of gold, The little bell over Theo's shop door rang gently. It wasn't a customer from the village. It was a traveler, a woman with wind-blushed cheeks, a woven satchel slung over her shoulder, and boots so worn they whispered of miles already walked. Theo looked up from the bench where he was sewing a pair of children's boots and smiled warmly. Come in, come in. Snow's no friend to tired feet." The woman chuckled and stepped inside, pausing to take in the glow of the workshop. Her eyes swept over the shelves lined with beautiful shoes, then stopped on the tiny pair perched on the top shelf no bigger than thimbles. She smiled. "I heard stories," she said, brushing snow from her scarf, "about a shop at the edge of a village that makes shoes stitched with something more than thread." Theo set down his tools and offered her a seat beside the fire. "I do my best," he replied with a modest shrug, pouring her a cup of hot tea. As Button jumped onto the bench beside them, the traveler sipped and sighed in contentment. She leaned in and lowered her voice. "They say magic visited here, that your hands aren't the only ones crafting in this place." Theo only chuckled, eyes twinkling behind his glasses. "Well now, that's a lovely thing to believe." The woman tilted her head, smiling in return. "I once met a woodcutter who swore he heard laughter in the trees at midnight. Said he saw flickers of golden light dancing just beyond the snow." Theo didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked over at the mantel, where the wooden charm still hung a tiny shoe that shimmered in the firelight, untouched by time. Then he looked back at the traveler. "I think sometimes," he said slowly, "when the world forgets how to be kind, it needs a little reminder." She nodded, and kindness often finds its way back. Before she left, Theo handed her a fresh pair of boots, soft, sturdy, and lined with felt. She tried to protest, but he shook his head. "A gift," he said, "for a story worth hearing." And when she stepped outside, her footprints joined the countless others leading away from Theo's door, proof that the magic of the elves, the warmth of the shoemaker, and the power of a simple thank you could travel farther than anyone imagined. The days began to stretch a little longer. The snow didn't fall quite as often, and icicles melted into rivulets that trickled down rooftops, singing the quiet song of approaching spring. Inside the little shop, the warmth remained. Not just the kind that came from the hearth, but the kind that lived in the smiles of visitors, in the hum of Theo's voice as he worked, and in the light footsteps of children who rushed through the door just to say hello. Theo had never been busier, but he had also never been so at peace. The villagers often said the shop had changed. They couldn't explain why exactly. It wasn't the shoes, though those were still as fine as ever. It wasn't the wood-paneled walls or the smell of leather and beeswax. It was something else. "Feels like hope in here," someone once said. And they were right. As winter softened, Theo began to tidy up the shop in small, deliberate ways. He dusted the charm every morning. He stitched new curtains with cheerful patterns. And one day, he carved a little plaque for the wall beside the door. It didn't bear his name or any prices. It simply said, "Made with kindness, meant to last." One afternoon, he stepped outside to sweep the porch and found a group of children clustered around a small patch of snow that hadn't melted yet. They were giggling and pointing. "Look!" one cried. "Tiny footprints!" Theo walked over slowly. Sure enough, there in the slush were 5 perfect indentations, small as buttons, curved like little boots. They led in a circle, then vanished entirely as if someone had taken flight right from the ground. The children began to spin stories immediately. They came back. They're watching. They're hiding in the woods again. Theo listened quietly, then knelt beside them, smiling. "Maybe they never left," he said. "Maybe they just let us do the magic for a while." The children's eyes sparkled, wide and wondering. Then, with delighted shrieks, they dashed off to the square to tell anyone who would listen. Theo watched them go, heart swelling. The magic was still here, not in twinkling lights or sudden gifts, but in imagination, in giving, in the soft, impossible hope that something good was always at work, just beyond what could be seen. He turned back toward the shop. Button was watching from the window, her tail curled neatly around her paws. Theo smiled. Inside, a new pair of shoes waited to be finished. A letter from a nearby village requested a special order, and a tiny note left by one of the children, drawn in crayon, sat on the counter beside a glass of warm milk. "Thank you for the best shoes ever!" The seasons were changing, but the story, it was far from over. Spring crept into the village on quiet toes. It arrived not all at once, but gently in the shy green buds on tree branches, in the sudden chorus of birds returning to rooftops, and in the way the breeze now smelled faintly of earth instead of frost. Inside the little shop, Theo had switched from stitching winter boots to crafting lighter shoes, soft leather slippers for dancing, sandals with tiny buckles for children eager to leap into puddles, and lace-up shoes that would carry gardeners through new soil. He found himself humming more often as he worked. Even Button seemed livelier, chasing scraps of ribbon across the floor like a kitten again. But something else had begun to stir too. It started with a letter. It arrived in an envelope tied with twine, bearing the postmark of a village Theo hadn't heard from in years. Inside was a note written in neat, careful script. "Dear Shoemaker, we heard of the wonder in your shop shoes stitched with joy and kindness. We were wondering if you might teach others how to make such shoes. There are children here who've never worn a pair made just for them. Sincerely, a hopeful teacher." Theo read it twice, then sat quietly for a long time, turning the charm in his fingers, the one still hanging on the thin golden thread above his bench. Then he smiled. Over the next few weeks, he gathered scraps, polished tools, and cleared a table in the back of the shop. He placed a second stool beside it, and then a third. Soon, children began to arrive first. 1, then 3, then 5. They came with eyes wide and hands eager. Some had never held a needle. Others couldn't tell one kind of leather from another. But they listened, they learned, and Theo taught them everything he knew. How to measure twice and cut once. How to soften stubborn leather. How to sew with hands that cared about the feet that would walk in the shoes. He even let them pick their own thread colors, a fact they found endlessly delightful. Button supervised from her perch near the window, tail flicking whenever a student got too silly. Theo never charged a single coin. He told them, "These shoes are for learning, for growing, for giving, not selling." And in time, the shop changed again. The shelves filled not just with shoes, but with laughter and stories. The sound of young voices floated through the windows each afternoon. And on the walls, Theo hung sketches and patterns drawn by his students, each with their own little stamp or signature. The magic, once hidden behind midnight curtains, now lived out in the open in every stitch taught, in every mistake corrected, in every smile shared between an old shoemaker and the next generation of kind-hearted crafters. One day, as the sun set over a field of daffodils outside the shop, a new pair of tiny shoes sat on the windowsill, too small for any student to have made for themselves, too perfect for it to be a beginner's work. And tucked inside, one of them just barely visible, was a single, silvery blue thread. Theo saw it. He said nothing, but he smiled, because even as the world bloomed anew, the elves had left their thread behind, weaving springtime into every quiet act of love. Years passed. The little village grew in quiet ways. A new bakery opened on the corner. More children filled the schoolyard, and the seasons spun their familiar rhythm, painting the rooftops with snow, sun, leaves, and blossoms. But one thing never changed. The shoemaker's shop, nestled under its weathered wooden sign, still glowed with the kind of light you couldn't bottle or buy, the light of stories whispered between stitches, of kindness sewn into souls, souls of laughter echoing softly behind closed doors. Inside, Theo's hands grew slower, but never clumsy. His eyes sometimes needed a brighter lamp, but they never lost their sparkle. And though he now let his students do most of the stitching, He still sat at the bench every morning with Button curled beside him, watching, guiding, smiling. Some days he would tell stories. Not all of them were about elves. Some were about the first shoes he ever made. Others were about the time a little boy asked for red boots because he thought they would make him fly. A few were simply about leather, soft, strong, and made to last. But every now and then, when the air outside turned sharp and snow began to dust the window panes, he would tell that story. About the night shoes appeared on his bench as if by magic. About the giggles behind the curtains. About 2 tiny coats stitched with love. And he would end it with the same words each time. Kindness doesn't disappear. It walks on. The children would always ask, "Did the elves ever come back?" Theo would shrug, eyes twinkling. "Maybe not the same way, but I see their footprints now and then in the smile of a stranger, in the gift left without a name, in the help no one asked for, but needed most." And that was always enough. One winter, when the snow piled high and stars glittered like frost, Theo left something in the window. 2 tiny boots and a pom-pom hat, just in case someone small was passing through and needed warmth. The next morning, they were gone. In their place, a small note sat beneath the wooden charm. It read, "Still dancing, still stitching, still watching with joy. Thank you, Theo." And that was the last time he ever saw a sign of them. But Theo didn't need more. He had a shop full of students, a heart full of stories, and a world full of people who had learned from shoes and elves and kindness itself that magic wasn't something rare. It was something made, one stitch at a time. The end.